Our upcoming speakers, just to preview for the rest of the year. Next month, we've got Jennifer Murray, who's going to be speaking on George Meade, was the subject of her new biography that she's done. In November, Caroline Newhall will be talking about Confederate policy towards and the treatment of United States colored troops who became prisoners of war. And in December, at what should be our first live session or in-person session, Larry Daniel, who will be talking about why the Army of Tennessee failed. And Larry has written a lot about the Army of Tennessee, knows about as much as anybody. As with all of our Zoom sessions, we ask that you stay on mute while the speaker presents. If you have questions, use the chat function to write them in, and we'll do a Q&A at the end. Tonight's speaker, the story of Civil War naval operations in the Mississippi River Valley is usually told from the Union perspective. Tonight's speaker, Neil Chatelain, is joining us for the first time, and he's going to be giving a different perspective based on his recent book, Defending the Arteries of Rebellion, Confederate Naval Operations in the Mississippi River Valley. That book was selected as one of the top 15 by Book Authority as one of the top 15 Civil War naval operations books of all time, and is one of the top 10 books of 2020 by Civil War Books and Authors, which is a great website if you want to keep up to date on what new books coming out and reviews of those books. Neil's a professor specializing in naval operations of the Civil War, and he currently lives and teaches in Texas. He was born and raised in New Orleans, and he's also served as a U.S. Navy surface warfare officer. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Neil and let him go ahead.
All right, well, thanks for the fantastic introduction. I'm really happy to be here tonight, and just give me a second to start sharing my screen here. I think it's going now, so it should be coming up here for a moment for all of you. First off, thanks for having me here. It's really exciting to be part of the Scottsdale group, and you've got some really good numbers coming, so it's pretty awesome. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started, I suppose. So like they said, my topic's going to be Defending the Arteries of Rebellion, which is sort of a look at Confederate naval operations in the Mississippi River Valley as a whole. And it's not to discount the efforts of the United States Navy, of course, but just to offer an alternative perspective as to why certain naval operations went certain ways and so on. So let's give it a shot. This is what we mostly think of when we think of the Mississippi River's naval campaigns. We think of the Mississippi River, but there's a lot more to it than just the Mississippi River. And if you go through all of the internal waterways, the tributary systems, the distributary systems, the lakes, the bayous, and so on, we've got a significant difference in waterways that were contested actively by US and Confederate naval forces. And so all of these different systems had naval campaigning done in one form or another. Some it was very small and minuscule. Others had very significant naval battles, and we're going to kind of gloss over what of which of these waterways and which of these systems had that conflict overall. But it's just kind of important to remember that we're talking about a much larger body of water with all of these internal systems that feed into or out of the Mississippi River itself. So just something to keep in mind. Confederate naval ambitions. So the Confederacy actually significantly made efforts in the Mississippi River to try to bring about a legitimate naval force, which was designed on paper at least to gain parity with the United States Navy on the Mississippi River Valley. And so what we see is that in the first year of the war, the Confederacy is going to make the Mississippi River a priority for naval construction operations. And you can see that in 1861, it kind of makes sense because most of the Confederacy's capacity to build warships is on the Mississippi River. We've got 7 major shipyards in the Mississippi River Valley in New Orleans and in Memphis, Tennessee predominantly, but in other areas as well as Nashville, Brashear City, modern day Morgan City, Louisiana, and Plaquemine, Louisiana. These are the major shipyards on the River Valley itself, as compared to 4 in the entire rest of the Confederacy. And one of those is Pensacola, which the US Navy blockaded from even before the start of the war itself. So that was rendered useless essentially. And then we have Mobile, Savannah, and the Gosport Navy Yard in Norfolk. So what we have is a significant advantage for the Confederacy compared to other parts of their coastline for construction of larger warships, ultimately ironclad warships. And the result of that is that in the first year of the Civil War, the Confederacy begins ironclad construction programs, and a vast majority of them are on the Mississippi River and its tributary system. 2 ironclads are constructed in the first year of the war in South Carolina. They're laid down. That's gonna be what becomes the Confederate ironclads Chicora and Palmetto State. 2 were laid down in Virginia in the Gosport Navy Yard. That's the Virginia, the conversion of the Merrimack, and then later on the ironclad Richmond, which gets finished up in Richmond, Virginia. Compared to that, the Confederacy had 9 ironclad programs on the Mississippi River Valley. So it's a significantly larger number. Those 9 are going to be the ironclad privateer Manassas, which then enters the Confederate Navy, the ironclads Louisiana and Mississippi at New Orleans. We have the Tennessee and Arkansas and Memphis. There is the Eastport on the Tennessee River. And then we've got several unnamed ironclads on Bayou St. John and in New Orleans that were never finished and brought to a successful conclusion. In fact, they barely even got started. But the point is, in the first year of the war, the Confederacy planned 9 ironclads on paper for active operations in 1862 when they're going to go against the United States Navy. Combine that with other efforts in the New Orleans area predominantly, but also in the Memphis area for creating a marine hospital for treating sailors, a naval laboratory for bringing forth weapons, shells, powder, friction primers, all those sorts of things, plus all the lead works, the iron works, the shoe factories in the city of New Orleans. And what we have is a major naval infrastructure that's growing in the city of New Orleans in the first year of the war, with a backup system growing in the city of Memphis. And the overall takeaway here is that the Mississippi River was a priority for the Confederacy, not just for the Army, because the Army called it Department Number 1 for the city of New Orleans, but the Confederate Navy actively sought to maintain control of this system by making it a priority for their construction programs. A major element of those construction programs is the use of enslaved labor. So what we have here is that in multiple avenues, through multiple different methods, enslaved persons were used by the Confederate Navy to maintain an active infrastructure going. Elements of this include skilled craftsmen that were hired out to shipyards individually as skilled persons who were trained to perform specific tasks. In certain instances, especially in the areas around New Orleans, entire teams of enslaved persons augmented shipyards and worked night shifts or augmented as just manual labor to help move systems around, infrastructure around. On the Yazoo River, we had plantation infrastructure that was brought in by enslaved persons to try to fortify the systems on the Yazoo River. Basically, they would take small steam engines and so on and bring them collectively together to try and use them instead of larger naval facilities. We also had enslaved persons constructing support fortifications for the Army, as well as to support naval shipyards and so on. And in a couple of instances, there are even enslaved persons manning Confederate naval vessels. That was predominantly in the area near Little Rock, Arkansas, where basically they would take the Confederate crew of a ship, take most of the sailors from the ship, and send them to another vessel in another area, a few hundred miles away, in an area that was more actively engaged. And then enslaved labor would be used to kind of keep the ship operating with a skeleton crew. So we have a lot of significant different elements of enslaved labor being used by the Confederate Navy here. And it's just something important to keep in mind, is that without that labor, they're not as effective and their timeline significantly gets hindered, their timeline is going to get hindered anyway. The first year of the Civil War, while all of these construction efforts are going on the Mississippi River Valley, there is still preliminary active campaigns being done by the United States and Confederate naval forces. And the first of those major areas is in the city of New Orleans, where privateering gets built from the first point. So the first Confederate privateers operated out of New Orleans, and they maintained operations there for a couple of months until the US Navy's blockade started to take shape. Beyond that, there was actually a contest for control of Ship Island, Mississippi, which is the place where David Farragut is going to launch his assaults on both the city of New Orleans and the city of Mobile. The Confederates occupied the island for a time, and then they abandoned it because they didn't have the naval support to keep it supplied. And then the US Navy and a US Army occupied the island to make it a staging point. We also have early conflict upriver when Leonidas Polk goes into Kentucky in late 1861. The Confederate Navy has a warship supporting him, and that warship then helps to fortify the town of Columbus until Polk's forces can bring heavy artillery to Columbus to make that the so-called first Gibraltar of the West, of Vicksburg being the second one, of course. In October 1861, the Confederate Navy launches an attack against the US blockading fleet at the head of passes, and it's the first case of an ironclad being used in the Civil War period, and that's the Confederate ironclad Manassas. The Confederacy successfully pushes the US Navy out of the head of passes, which is where all the river channels merge to make one single channel. But then the US Navy just keeps blockading all the different mouths and open channels to the open Gulf of Mexico. So it's sort of a victory where they don't really capitalize on anything, and the US blockade remains in force. November 1861, back upriver, there's the Battle of Belmont, where the Confederacy is kind of pushed back to the coastline, to the riverbank, and then the Confederate Navy and some Army forces then help cross reinforcements from Columbus to the Belmont, Missouri area to drive back Ulysses Grant's forces. So Grant seizes the initiatives, takes the battlefield, and then retreats after the Confederacy sends ships to move more reinforcements across the Mississippi. From July 1861 to March 1862, there was a series of skirmishes by naval forces of both sides on coastal Louisiana and coastal Mississippi for control of the Mississippi Sound, Lake Borgne area. That's the waterway between Mobile and the city of New Orleans. And this active campaigning went back and forth for about 6 months. And the result of that is that eventually the Confederate naval forces were sort of overwhelmed, mostly because David Farragut's squadron was arriving to then begin the campaign against New Orleans. And then, of course, the construction efforts by both sides, the Confederate construction efforts that we've talked about just now, and then the construction efforts by the US Navy to build the city-class ironclads and so on further upriver in Illinois and Missouri. Now we got to talk about what the Confederate Navy envisioned its plans and its fleet to look like. And the problem here is that there really wasn't a big organizational unified plan. Everybody who had an opinion about operating naval forces on the Mississippi River made their opinion known and sometimes just formed their own naval forces themselves. And what we have here is significant different organizations that are going to fight each other for supplies, and they're going to contest each other for manpower, and then argue with one another when the time comes to see who's going to fight and who's not going to fight. We, of course, have the Confederate naval forces. They're going to be the predominant force, the actual regular Confederate Navy augmented by its Marine Corps. We're going to see the numbers for them as well. The Confederacy also operated the Revenue Marine, the equivalent of the US Revenue Marine, which was the equivalent of the modern day US Coast Guard. And they had 2 Marine cutters operating at New Orleans that were captured at the beginning of the Civil War from the US Revenue Marine. The Confederate Army has gunboats operating on the river and in the coastal portions of Louisiana as well, a few ships as well. The Confederate River Defense Fleet is kind of the famous group that they did their own thing. They organized themselves. They were technically part of the Army, but they were all civilian contractors who answered to the Secretary of War, not to the Chief of the Army or to the President or to naval forces in a local area, or even to generals in a local area. James Montgomery and his River Defense Fleet, sometimes they're going to cooperate with the Confederate Navy. Sometimes they're basically going to point and laugh at the Confederate Navy and ignore everything they ask. There's also privateers, mostly operating out of the New Orleans area, and those privateers are largely going to end up serving the Confederacy either as vessels of the Confederate Navy or later as transports by the Confederate Army or contracted by the government. And then we have civilian steamers contracted by the Confederate government, either for naval service or for Army service or for other service, plus civilian blockade runners that are going to go in and out of the city as well. So pretty much anybody who had a hand in it was involved in this overall. The man kind of responsible for everything here is Captain George Hollands. He's the senior military, the naval commander for the Mississippi River Valley. He's responsible for the entire Mississippi River, as well as everything west of Mobile, Alabama, all the way to the Louisiana-Texas border. And so he has a significant amount of water space, both on the river part and on the coastline, that he is responsible for. He has a couple of subordinates. There are some subordinates that he uses so that when he is not in a particular area, those people act on his behalf. Commander Robert Pinckney is going to operate Confederate naval forces up the river. Commander John Mitchell is going to operate forces downriver when Hollands goes from one end of the river to the other, because he will be making personal appearances at different elements. But there's even more confusion to all this. Just because Hollands is in charge of active ships, he's actually not in charge of ship construction on the Mississippi River. Captain William Whittle of the Confederate Navy is in charge of ship construction and the New Orleans Naval Station. And there's actually, in the Confederate laws and regulations of the naval service, ship commanders and fleet commanders are separate from station commanders. And so Whittle's responsible for ships up until the point that they are finished. Hollands is responsible for ships the moment they are finished and ready for service. Sometimes they don't answer to one another. Sometimes they don't cooperate with one another. And that becomes a major issue, especially during the campaigns for New Orleans, when Hollands is somewhere else and his subordinates are trying to handle things, and Whittle doesn't always cooperate with those subordinates. And it just brings about more confusion. Let's talk about the numbers here. The chart kind of looks a little bit confusing at the first glance. Just focus on the far left bar at first. The far left bar is the planned number of ships that the Confederate Navy is intending to operate in 1862's naval campaigns for the Mississippi River. They know the US Navy is coming. They know the US Navy is going to be large. They're making plans to operate 9 ironclads in 1862, the 9 that we talked about already, 45 wooden vessels in 1862, and 5 wooden sailing vessels or floating batteries. With the exception of the ironclads, the Confederate Navy actually almost completes all of these craft. 35 of the 45 wooden vessels that they plan to operate, wooden steam vessels, enter active service in sea combat. 4 of the 5 sailing vessels and floating batteries actively enter service in sea combat. Only 1 floating battery doesn't get completed. The problem, though, is the ironclads. Of the 9 ironclads prepared by the Confederacy, only 3 are going to get finished by the time they enter active service and the US Navy comes to combat them. One of those is the ironclad Manassas, used in the Head of the Passes battle in late 1861, but it's very small and only has 1 cannon on it. Another one is the ironclad Louisiana, which gets finished 2 days after David Farragut passes the ship and the fortifications defending New Orleans, and so they just blow the ship up after that. And the third one is the ironclad Arkansas, which does its famous ride down to Vicksburg from the Yazoo River, which we'll look at on the map here in a little bit. Compare that to the US naval forces intending to operate and actively operating on the Mississippi River that same year. Farragut's Western Gulf Blockading Squadron has 25 wooden steamers and 29 mortar vessels. Those are sailing vessels with a mortar and maybe 1 cannon on them. The Western Gunboat Flotilla, that's the forces under Admiral Foote and then later Captain Davis. 10 ironclads, those are the city-class ironclads that are going to get built further upriver. 11 mortar vessels supporting them, and then 4 wooden steamers. Those are the timberclads, the ships that are used at the Battle of Shiloh, for example. And then there's the US Ram Fleet further upriver as well, which is a copy of the Confederate River Defense Fleet that is then used to basically destroy the Confederate River Defense Fleet when they're defending Memphis later on. On paper, the Confederacy intended to have 9 ironclads, 45 wooden ships, and 5 sailing vessels or floating batteries, compared to 10 ironclads of the US Navy, about 40 wooden gunboats of the US Navy, and about 40 mortar vessels. If you trade the mortar vessels off for Confederate fortifications, gun for gun, and balance those out, on paper, the Confederacy intended to have parity with the US Navy. The problem is that the US Navy statistics here are what actually entered combat, whereas the Confederacy fell far short, especially in ironclads, largely because of a number of factors: running out of time, better support for the US Navy, and then the lack of cooperation in this organizational struggle by the Confederate naval forces. So this 1862 river campaign is what I kind of call the campaign of decision. It's the year of decision. And what we have here is multiple different groups defending the Mississippi River. The Confederate Navy has 20 of those 42 or so ships that are operating. Louisiana has 2 ships operating in their own navy. The Revenue Service has 2 ships. The Confederate Army has 4. The River Defense Fleet's going to bring 14 vessels to bear. And so we have many different organizations challenging one another for defeating the US Navy and competing to see who's going to get the upper hand themselves. So this 1862 year of decision is the year where the US Navy essentially takes control over most of the Mississippi River. And what we see is that they're doing a coordinated assault both upriver from its mouth and downriver from Illinois, Kentucky, and Missouri. February 1862, the Fort Henry, Fort Donelson campaign is launched. US timberclads and ironclads are used in that capacity, letting them gain combat experience. March and April 1862, the Island No. 10 campaign is launched after the city of Columbus is evacuated following the loss of Fort Henry and Donelson because they're outflanked. May 1862, Fort Pillow, the Battle of Plum Point Bend, where the Confederate River Defense Fleet launches a counterattack. And then June 1862, the loss of the city of Memphis by the Confederacy after Corinth, Mississippi is captured by the United States following the Battle of Shiloh, resulting in Memphis evacuating. The Confederate River Defense Fleet launches a rear guard action there, and they ultimately get virtually destroyed at that point. But notice we're talking about consistent naval operations being enacted: February, March, April, May, June. It's almost a continuous back and forth fight. In the lower Mississippi River Valley, we have the Campaign for New Orleans by David Farragut. That starts in March 1862, and New Orleans falls late April, early May, and then Farragut continues moving upriver from there. In the Central Valley, following those 2 campaigns, we have US naval forces advancing up the White River, where Confederate naval forces fighting on land disable a US ironclad and halt US advances up the White River ultimately. And then we have the campaigns around Vicksburg with the CSS Arkansas's famous ride past the Yazoo River into the city of Vicksburg, defying the combined squadrons of David Farragut and Captain Davis there. And then the Confederacy launches a counterattack. Part of the big counterattacks in the fall of 1862, while Confederate military forces are moving into Kentucky, Maryland, and moving against the town of Corinth eventually, they're also marching south to attack the capital city of Louisiana at Baton Rouge to theoretically, hopefully retake the city of New Orleans. That ultimately fails when John Breckinridge's army doesn't capture Baton Rouge, largely because the Confederate ironclad Arkansas breaks down on the way a bunch because their captain and chief engineer were not present. And then the ironclad Arkansas is destroyed, ultimately within the sight of US naval forces near Baton Rouge. And then the Arkansas's crew goes to Port Hudson, and they help establish the fortifications at Port Hudson initially in September 1862. So what we have is a significant number of campaigns, and the result is that at the end of 1862, that's that famous, the Confederacy only holds these 90 miles of river left. And it's not because the US Navy didn't try these areas, it's because falling water, Confederate counterattacks halted the US naval advance, leaving those 90 miles of river in Confederate naval hands. So most of the Confederate naval forces are destroyed by the end of 1862, but that doesn't stop the Confederate Navy from trying to reconstitute naval forces to be a viable defense of maybe not the river itself, but its tributaries and distributary waters. New naval yards operated by the Confederate Navy are enacted at Yazoo City, Mississippi, and Shreveport, Louisiana, and reconstructed squadrons are attempted to be formed in virtually the entire area, the entire river valley, in all of these inland waters that feed into or out of the Mississippi itself. On the Red River, they're going to try and build an ironclad warship that's going to become the ironclad Missouri. They're going to make plans as well to build other ironclads, but those never work out. And then they have several steam vessels that survived the escape from New Orleans that are part and augmenting that. 4 river steamers are operating on the Atchafalaya River to try and keep that in Confederate hands. On Bayou Teche in far southern Louisiana, they have 1 partial ironclad vessel. They have another river steamer supporting them, and they're trying to build another ironclad from scratch. On the Yazoo River, there are several steamers defending the area, and they are trying to convert and build 3 ironclads at the naval yard there. And then on the Arkansas River, defending Little Rock, there were a couple of river steamers as well. So what we have is several reconstituted programs to build ironclad warships at the Yazoo River, at Bayou Teche, the Tennessee River, and the Red River. These are all proposed. At the Yazoo River, they start making these 3 ironclads, and they're about halfway done by the time Vicksburg falls. On Bayou Teche, they start making this ironclad. On the Red River, they successfully make this ironclad. The Tennessee River ones don't get past the paper and contracting phases because they're using the same resources as ironclads being built to defend Mobile. 1863 comes, and we have the famous campaigns by Ulysses Grant to seize control of the Vicksburg area. He's launching significant numbers of campaigns. Confederate naval forces are there to challenge those campaigns. At Fort Hinman, Arkansas, when John McClernand goes up to capture that area in early 1863, the people actually manning the fortifications in Fort Hinman are Confederate naval forces, and then the Army is operating in the fortifications outside the main fort. And the commanders of the Confederate naval forces there hold joint commissions as both Confederate colonels in the Army and as lieutenants in the Navy simultaneously. At Fort Pemberton, where the Grant's forces try to move south from that avenue, the Confederate Navy scuttles several of their ships to block the passage there, which forces the U.S. Navy to stop at Fort Pemberton instead of running past it, which halts the U.S. naval advance there. And then there are significant avenues and advances in 1863 near Vicksburg itself, where the Confederate Navy is supplying the U.S. Navy overall. Also on this Yazoo River area, that's where torpedo warfare first starts getting employed. On the Yazoo River, the USS Cairo gets destroyed in December 1862, but other ironclads also get destroyed by torpedoes in the same area, including the USS Baron de Kalb in July 1863, right after the loss of Vicksburg by the Confederacy. So what we have is that by mid-1863, the river itself is in U.S. hands, and the Confederacy's naval forces are kind of fracturing in the Yazoo area. After Vicksburg falls, Yazoo City falls into U.S. hands. The ironclad programs there are destroyed, and all the supply vessels that are supporting Vicksburg for the Confederacy, and then after Vicksburg gets cut off, are supporting Joseph Johnston's failed relief efforts. They all get scuttled, and most of the crews of these Confederate vessels on the Yazoo River and these other internal rivers end up moving to Mobile to help augment the naval forces there. So Vicksburg's in U.S. hands, and that's largely where the story ends for the most part, and most of the stories about naval warfare on the Mississippi River. But there's, of course, a significant continuation of naval efforts, some occurring during the Vicksburg campaign and many occurring after. For example, there's skirmishing during the Vicksburg campaign up the Red River, where the Confederacy captures a couple of U.S. naval ships, including an ironclad vessel that they then scuttle because it is about to be recaptured by the U.S. Navy. And those skirmishes keep the Red River in Confederate hands for another year until the U.S. Navy tries again in 1864, the Red River Campaign of 64. There's campaigning down Bayou Teche, where the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Army successfully destroy Confederate naval efforts and defeat the Confederate Army's efforts in southern Louisiana. Those are the same soldiers that are going to then march on, invest, and capture Port Hudson. While Confederate naval forces are being destroyed on Bayou Teche, U.S. naval forces also simultaneously destroy the Confederate naval forces on the Atchafalaya River, sweeping southern Louisiana out of the Confederacy as far as naval forces are concerned. In late 1863, U.S. military efforts moving towards Little Rock forced the Confederacy to destroy the remainder of their couple of ships that are left in the Arkansas River, so there's no longer any Confederate naval forces there. The Red River Campaign of 64 sees the Confederate ironclad Missouri ready in a supporting role. However, the U.S. Navy never gets far upriver enough where the Missouri is at to contest it. And instead, Confederate naval forces are using torpedoes, and they're using the support systems for the Army with reconstituting dams and reflowing river water to try and trap David Porter's naval forces there. And so the Confederacy naval forces aren't engaged actively in the 64 Red River Campaign, but they're standing by and they're providing support services for what's going on. Confederate cavalry from the Army capture a few U.S. naval warships on the Yazoo River in 1864. They literally roll up with their horses and some horse artillery, disable some ships, and board them and capture them. And the U.S. Navy has to do another sweep of the Yazoo River in 1864 to clear out Confederate operations there. Same thing on the White River. Confederate cavalry start operating there, capture a few ships, and then get out of there once the U.S. Navy has to resend forces to reconstitute their control of the area. The Tennessee River in 1864 is the same thing, but on a much wider scale. This is General Nathan Bedford Forrest capturing the Johnsonville Supply Depot. And in that, he captures several U.S. warships, puts his horse artillery on the warships, and then uses them to destroy the supply depot and the transports going back and forth. And that's all to try and break the Union supply chain so that John Bell Hood's army can then recapture Nashville, Tennessee, which of course that ultimately ends in failure as well. In April 1865, even as Robert E. Lee is surrendering his army in Virginia and Joseph Johnston is debating his surrenders, Confederate guerrilla activity captures a warship on the Hatchie River in 1865. Ultimately, all they do is capture it and then just burn it right away. There are some final operations on the Red River in March to June 1865, where the Confederate warship Webb escapes the Red River, and their goal is to go all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico and start out as a commerce raider. They actually get the Webb gets destroyed at Fort Jackson and St. Philip. The commander of the Webb is one of the guys who was a naval commander defending Fort Jackson and St. Philip in 1862. So 3 years later, almost to the day, he ends up surrendering again within the sight of the same spot he did before. And then the ironclad Missouri is the final Confederate ironclad to surrender in the war. And it does so in June 1865, after word of all the other surrenders finally makes it to Western Louisiana. So that's kind of an overview of the campaigns by the naval forces of the Confederacy. It's also worth noting that there are significant innovations by the Confederacy in their naval forces on the Mississippi River. Commerce raiding originated in New Orleans with the raider Sumter. Privateering originated in New Orleans. Amphibious operations by the Confederacy, joint military naval army naval operations were done by the Confederacy in New Orleans, with them trying to capture and maintain control of Ship Island in 1861. The first U.S. ironclad in North America, period, was the ironclad Manassas used by the Confederacy. That vessel introduced the ram as a viable weapon before the Virginia used ramming tactics in 1862. And then we have the River Defense Fleet with its ramming tactics that the U.S. Navy will then copy with the U.S. Ram Fleet further upriver. Submersibles were experimented with on the Mississippi River and in Lake Pontchartrain, just north of New Orleans. The Pioneer was the submarine that was tested in the New Orleans area. After New Orleans fell, they scuttled the submarine there, moved to Mobile, built another Pioneer #2 there, And then from there, they moved to Charleston, where they ultimately, the same team built the H.L. Hunley. I just mentioned the ram fleet, and then of course, torpedoes, underwater mines that were first successfully used by the Confederacy as a naval weapon on the Yazoo River, but they were also naval mines used near Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Columbus, Kentucky, elsewhere. And then of course that gets copied and emulated elsewhere, most famously at Mobile Bay, where David Farragut goes past a bunch of them. So a significant area of naval innovation by the Confederacy, sometimes out of desperation, sometimes out of just trying new things. Here's the thing. The Confederacy had a lot of different naval operations. A lot of them brought about tactical successes. The problem is that these tactical victories by the Confederate naval forces could not bring about long-term strategic gains for the most part. So for example, the Confederate naval and army forces successfully held control of Ship Island, but then they gave it up because their naval forces couldn't support it. They successfully seized Columbus, Kentucky and fortified it, but that caused Kentucky to take a Union stance. They successfully engaged and pushed back the US blockading force at the head of passes in October 61, but they didn't break the blockade. It was still maintained in force. They defended and helped successfully evacuated Confederate military forces at New Madrid, Missouri in March 62, but that just left Island number 10 cut off and would ultimately surrender. The River Defense Fleet successfully sunk a couple of US naval ironclads north of Memphis in May 62, but those ironclads were then refloated and it didn't stop the US drive downriver. The Arkansas successfully saved Vicksburg. That's the biggest strategic victory for the Confederate naval forces on the Mississippi River. That keeps Vicksburg in Confederate hands for another year, but then they can't capitalize on it with a counterattack, and the Arkansas is lost at Baton Rouge. The Confederacy defends Bayou Teche in January 63, but then loses Bayou Teche 3 months later when the US Navy regroups. On the Red River, they capture several ships in mid-1863. That's another strategic victory. The Red River stays in Confederate hands for the remainder of the war at that point. These torpedo operations sink US naval ships. It keeps the Yazoo River in Confederate hands temporarily, but ultimately they lose control of that as well. The 1864 Red River campaign successfully holds off the Red River and keeps it in Confederate hands for the remainder of the war. Forrest's raids in 1864 in Tennessee successfully capture a large amount of US military supplies, but it doesn't successfully help John Bell Hood regain Tennessee for the Confederacy. And then all these final attacks by Confederate cavalry in other locations has no significance whatsoever. It looks good in the newspapers, doesn't change anything strategically at all. So what's the root causes here? The Confederate Navy actually tried, but they failed. Why? First big thing, lack of organization. All these different groups highlighted with the flags there at the bottom, you know, the Confederate Navy, the Confederate Army, the Revenue Marine, the Louisiana Navy, the Marine Corps, the River Defense Fleet, and so on. Who answered to who was a real question. Who was borrowing supplies from who? If somebody had a cannon, it came from somewhere else, and that was missing now in another ledger. Personnel would abandon one vessel, desert, and then enlist in another organization. And so manpower, supplies, organization, that was a major issue that the Confederacy ultimately could not fix and manage properly in the Mississippi River Valley. As I showed on the previous slide, the Confederacy was capable of winning battles. They could win local tactical victories with their naval forces, but then they could not capitalize on that. And the ultimate result was that the US Navy could then regroup very quickly and then continue their campaigns to destroy Confederate naval forces. And then, of course, it's definitely worth mentioning that a major effort for why the Confederate Navy failed was because the US Navy had something to do with it, of course. They had more ships, they had more men, it was better trained, it was better organized, they had more supplies. The Confederacy was able to localize victories, but the US Navy maintained this continuous operation that ultimately overwhelmed the efforts of the Confederate Navy. So it's kind of some final conclusions here for you. the Confederacy had ambitious plans to gain parity in 1862. Those plans were not successfully met. And instead, most of their naval forces were destroyed. They were able to reconstitute some of those forces to defend tributary waters or to delay US control of tributary waters, but ultimately, most of those were overwhelmed as well. The Mississippi River Valley was a hotbed of Confederate naval innovation, with all these new innovations being made by Confederate naval forces that were either emulated by Confederate naval forces elsewhere, emulated by the US Navy elsewhere, or just emulated by Army forces as well. And then one final hit here is against the old idea of the lost cause. Slavery, enslaved persons were vital to the Confederate naval effort. Without the enslaved persons operating shipyards, without the infrastructure of some of these plantation systems, the naval vessels would not have been as ready as they were, given the fact that they weren't even as ready as they wanted to be in the first place. And then, of course, the other element of the lost cause, besides the whole issue of the system of enslavement, is that the Confederacy stood no chance of victory. If you look at it from a different perspective, the Confederacy stood a real chance of at least delaying and stopping US naval forces. They may not have been able to defeat all of these naval forces, but on paper, they had a real plan that they could not capitalize on. And for the most part, the numbers that they attempted to make were enacted, at least in the first element of the war. And it wasn't until 1862's US naval campaigns that they just could not recover from that to bring about a final, reconstituted naval force to gain that ultimate parity. So the Confederacy had a plan, they just could not capitalize on it, especially after the plan started to fall apart in some elements. That being said, I'll go ahead and stop talking there, and I'm opening it up for some questions. If you're interested in buying a copy of my book there, if you go to the Savas PD website and enter the coupon code there, free media ship, that gets you free shipping from them. They'll give you a little note card with my signature in it, that kind of stuff. So they like to do those kind of things. Or if you're interested in learning more about my research, particularly, you can go visit my website, neilpchatelain.com. And with that, I'll open it up to some questions from everybody. Let me stop sharing my screen and we'll start from there.
Thanks, Neil. We have, just a reminder to everybody, just put your questions into chat. We have a question already, which is, where did the Confederates get the iron to clad the ironclads on the Mississippi?
So it came from a few different places. To begin with, the city of New Orleans had several iron foundries and several iron works that they were able to successfully create iron plate at. They also, the Confederate ironclads in the first year of the war were using iron plate made in Atlanta as well. And in some cases, even as far as Tredegar in Virginia, where they were making iron plate there. After the city of New Orleans falls and these ironclads get destroyed and then the new ironclads are being reconstituted, that's mostly, for the most part, railroad iron that is being captured and converted into plate iron, or it is railroad iron that is then being puzzled together to create a makeshift iron fortification. So for example, the ironclad Manassas had in 1861 iron bars that were dovetailed together to try and form a makeshift barrier. The ironclad Missouri on the Red River had railroad iron that was basically layered on top of each other, bolted in place like that. They didn't even try to make plate for it. They just bolted iron bars on top of it. So it was local foundries in the Louisiana area. In some cases, it was also in Atlanta, Virginia. And then after that, it was wherever they could find stuff and try to melt it into something or to just bolt stuff onto the hulls of the ships.
Were there other raw materials or fixtures that were in short supply?
So the biggest issue with the Confederacy was engines. They didn't have the capacity to build engines from scratch. The ironclad Louisiana and the ironclad Mississippi in New Orleans in 1861 and 1862, they had to rip out engines from other ships that were river steamers and install those. They had to build a drive shaft at the Tredegar Iron Works because that was the only place that could build a drive shaft big enough for the ships. And that took up a lot of time and energy. And that's kind of where some of these delays come in, is like, oh, they're fighting for time against the US Navy attacking, and the Louisiana doesn't get built until 2 days after Farragut passes the forts. It's because they had to literally ship this engineering equipment from Virginia, because that was the only place in the Confederacy that could manufacture any of it. And what we see is that a lot of Confederate warships get gutted to provide engineering equipment for other warships later on in the war. So cannibalization definitely becomes a major factor.
We have a question. Was George Hollands a U.S. Navy officer before the war?
Yes, he absolutely was. He was at sea when the war began. I believe he was in the Mediterranean Sea, and he was one of the sailors who brought his ship back to the United States at the beginning of the war. And he then tendered his resignation and was first in Virginia, operating in the Chesapeake Bay before being ordered to New Orleans. But yeah, he was one of the guys. He had like a 40-year career in the US Navy before he ended up in the Confederate Navy.
Can you tell us a bit more about his career in the Confederacy?
So that was his entire career. So basically, Collins became the commander of the Mississippi River Naval Forces. He was operating up the river near island number 10. And when word came that Farragut was approaching the river from below, he said, "We have ships up here. We need leadership downriver because Farragut has more ships down there. We have better forts upriver. Let's take all the Confederate ships downriver." And he asked permission to take all of the ships downriver to face Farragut. The Confederate Navy Department said no. He went anyway. And when he reached the city of New Orleans, he got relieved of his command, opening up another major leadership gap at the same time that Farragut's coming up. And he spent the rest of the war literally doing desk work in Richmond, Virginia.
You mentioned a lot about the command problems, coordination. So the question is, and you mentioned the relief of Hollands, did the Confederate government ever try to rationalize those command problems? And I guess more broadly, what kind of strategic vision did they ever have?
So the Confederacy actually tried to fix some of these issues after the fact, after these 1862 campaigns. And what we see is that the Confederate military, the Confederate Congress is going to pass a law stating that the Confederate Army is going to gain dominance over the Confederate Navy when officers of equal rank are present. So if there's a Confederate colonel and a Confederate Navy captain, the colonel is going to hold sway over the Navy captain. And that's where we see more integrated command start later on in the war, such as at Charleston, South Carolina, with Beauregard and Confederate naval forces there. The Confederate government also passes a law, and I kind of mentioned this with the Fort Hidman thing, of the Confederacy will allow its military officers to hold joint commissions in the Navy and Army simultaneously. So they actually do make an effort later in the war to rectify this command issue, but it's not enough, and it's not soon enough to actually cause an issue, a change in the first year when it would have probably mattered the most in some of these campaigns.
How did it work, not just after they made these changes, but even in that first year? I mean, I'm thinking about Grant was known for being able to work with the naval officers even when he didn't have direct authority. So there was this ability to work together even without the formal command structure. What was the relationship between the Army and the various naval factions?
So officially, there really wasn't much of a relationship.
But just operationally, I guess.
Operationally, it was very much left to the local commanders to work together. And in a lot of cases, they worked pretty well together. On Lake Pontchartrain, Hollands had a lieutenant, like the equivalent Army captain, someone who's a company commander, a lieutenant commanding a couple of ships. He cooperated with the Confederate Army very well. They traded artillery cannons, they traded soldiers from forts to help man the ships when they needed extra support, and they worked really well together. But that's local commanders in an isolated area. Hollands, when he was upriver defending island number 10 and defending Memphis, worked really well with the military commanders there. They got along very well. And they successfully evacuated Confederate troops, moved them around, kept supply lines open, and all that kind of stuff. In other places, Army and naval forces didn't work so well together, particularly when it came time for that river defense fleet. The commander of the river defense fleet in the New Orleans area literally said he would not take orders from any naval officer ever. Now, that guy had a grudge because he was the guy who built the ironclad Manassas that the Confederate Navy just took from him, and then they paid for it like a few months later. So he had a grudge to bear, and he kept that grudge. But in some cases, naval officers, army officers, they worked really well. It was just a matter of who were they working with and who was willing to cooperate with one another, and could they put egos aside sometimes. It worked sometimes, it didn't other times.
We have a few more questions here. So Mallory had ambitions to contract for construction of ironclads in Europe. Were any of those planned for the river operations?
So the layered ironclads in England, and then the ironclads constructed in 1864 in France, they were going to be too big for river operations themselves. They would not have been able to get past the river bars at the channel of the river itself. Those were designed to smash into the U.S. Navy's blockade on the coastline and link up with Confederate local ironclads near the Wilmington, North Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina area. And then they could officially declare a break in the blockade, which would have a lot of international law ramifications. So those ships were never planned whatsoever to be river vessels at all.
I have a question in here. As a longtime student of the Civil War, I've never heard of Fort Livingston. I'm assuming it was on an island. Was it ever involved in a battle?
So Fort Livingston is one of these forts near the Confederate coastline, and it's part of an entire series of fortifications along the Louisiana coastline. There's Forts Jackson and St. Philip on the river itself, but besides that, we also have Fort Pike and Fort Macomb defending Lake Pontchartrain, and Fort Livingston defending the southern coastline of Louisiana. These are all just part of an outer ring of fortifications. The inner ring of New Orleans fortifications, of course, are going to be the ones where, like, the War of 1812 Battle of New Orleans with Andrew Jackson's fought, where the Confederates put a couple of cannons there. These were all manned by, like Fort Livingston and Fort Pike and Fort Macomb. They were manned by like 100 men, 150 men, a dozen cannons, maybe like that. They just weren't really challenged by the U.S. military at all, because Farragut chose instead to go up the river. So there wasn't really a battle at Livingston or Pike or Macomb, but the U.S. military will occupy each of those and maintain an occupation force there for the remainder of the war after they take control of them.
So they were abandoned after the fall of New Orleans by the Confederates?
Yeah, exactly.
Were there plans to use Hundley-like or submersibles in the Mississippi River area?
So the biggest plan of something like that is in the Shreveport area, where they built the ironclad Missouri. They had a couple of river steamers. There's also efforts and plans by Confederate naval and army forces to constitute some sort of semi-submersible vessel. And what we believe happened is that they constructed several torpedo boats, more akin to the David, sort of an idea, the Confederate torpedo boat David system, which then attacked the USS New Ironsides. We don't think that submersibles were going to work in the river and that it was torpedo boats instead, largely because you put a submarine under a river with a hand crank and it's not going to stem a river current. It's not going to be able to maneuver properly. Whereas even a small torpedo boat with a small makeshift steam engine will be able to successfully maneuver around and capture and be able to transport a couple of 100 pounds of gunpowder without an issue. So we do know that these craft were built at Shreveport, Louisiana. They were never employed because the U.S. Navy never got that far up the Red River, because they were stopped in the 64 Red River campaign by other methods. So that was sort of a last ditch effort sort of a thing, more akin to the same thing in the James River flotilla, defending Richmond, where they had a couple of ironclads defending Richmond, and then a couple of wooden ships, and then some torpedo boats as well there.
You had mentioned with the question about the European ironclads and the issues of breaking the blockade. So the question has come up: what are the international law ramifications if
there's
a blockade had been broken?
There's a treaty that was signed in 1850 that the United States was not a signatory to, called the Declaration of Paris in 1850. And the signatories of that treaty, it was designed to try and standardize things following the Crimean War. So a bunch of European countries followed it. And that treaty, that Declaration of Paris, stated that a blockade of a coastline could not be a paper blockade, meaning that you couldn't just say it existed. You had to actually enforce it. And if at any time it was not properly enforced, in the eyes of the international community, that blockade would then be declared abandoned by the force consisting of that blockade. And so if the Confederacy was able to break the US blockade and European powers were there, and there were European powers watching, the British Navy regularly patrolled the US coastline to check on the blockade to make sure it was sound and actually in place. And then there were British and French diplomats in Charleston and in Wilmington, local consuls, who reported on blockade matters to their governments to make sure that they were documenting this as well. So if the Confederate Navy would have been able to physically breach the blockade, what that would have meant was that these international actors and the British and the French would have been able to make a claim that the blockade was no longer in effect. And until Abraham Lincoln would then issue a new blockade by signing another executive order and then resending the fleet out again, technically, they wouldn't have the power to enforce that blockade in the eyes of the international community. What that really means is that the US Navy would just keep ships where they could and then try to enforce it as much as they could until diplomatic efforts took hold. The issue of it all is just that the international implications of all this can be something in the shadows that is kind of has a long-term effect, because we're not just talking about, the Civil War here. We're talking about, does the Monroe Doctrine still exist, where the US claims hegemony over Latin America? Is the US going to be the dominant power in the Americas, or is Britain going to try and make a resurgence? Because there's a lot of efforts by European powers to re-encroach in the Americas during our Civil War. And so the international law ramifications have a major impact on how is that shadow war essentially going to turn out in the eyes of the international community. It's pretty crazy stuff.
That's a great answer. I'll put out a last call for any more questions. And while we wait to see about that, I had one.
Sure.
The fall of New Orleans is so crucial in this whole process. And you mentioned, I guess, this guy Whittle and lack of cooperation. Do you think that with better coordination in the defense of New Orleans, that the Confederacy should have been able to hold on to the city? I mean, what's your assessment of that campaign and how it actually played out, or could have played out?
So to be perfectly honest, I think that if the Confederacy was better supplied, better organized, they could have stalled the capture of New Orleans by a few months, but it would not have prevented it. And my reasoning for this is that tactically, Hollands, when he was coming back downriver before he was relieved of command, had a plan to attack David Farragut's ships, seize the initiative, and try to stall things until Confederate ironclads would be constructed. And he couldn't enact that plan because he was relieved of his command when he showed up. However, besides that, there's also the idea of Hollands was going to attack Farragut's ships as they were crossing the river bar. Farragut knew that that was going to happen. He stationed warships well ahead of his main fleet as guard ships. He was prepared for such a thing, so that attack likely would have failed. As far as a bigger picture, if the Confederate ironclads in New Orleans were built and Farragut had decided that's not a good idea, to be perfectly honest, he would have just taken his smaller ships and attacked New Orleans the same way the British did in the War of 1812 by going through the Lake Borgne, Mississippi Sound, Lake Pontchartrain area. And the Confederacy did not have enough ships in that area to successfully stop the smaller amount of US naval forces. So it would have become a land campaign where Benjamin Butler would have a much bigger factor to play. But all that would have happened was that it would have stalled the inevitable, and then it would have been a mad dash to get all these Confederate ships out of the New Orleans area upriver to Vicksburg. Now that has a major factor later on in the war too, if there's Confederate ironclads there as well. But New Orleans would have been captured by the US Navy one way or another. They were determined to do it. It might have taken a few months more, it might have taken another year, but it was going to happen.
Well, we have just a couple of notes here for one of our members. Thanks for a great presentation on a subject that doesn't get enough attention. And then also similar and with a question, thanks for well-researched presentation. I'm looking forward to getting your new book. Is it carried by Barnes & Noble and Amazon? You mentioned Savas Beatty, but
it is on Amazon.com. You can order it through Amazon as well. There's an ebook version that's out on Amazon, which is about half the cost of the normal book. And I do believe that we have a paperback version of the book scheduled to come out early next year at some point. I don't have the fine details on that because they're still figuring that element of it out. It is also available on Barnes & Noble's website, and it is in a few Barnes & Noble stores in like New York City and Virginia. It might be in the Scottsdale area. I haven't personally checked to see if it is in one of y'all's stores over there.
And do you have plans for your next book?
Oh yeah, there's definitely plans. So my latest research has been on the Panama route, which is the transportation network between New York City, the Isthmus of Panama, and California. And basically what I've been researching a lot is the Civil War campaigns to kind of control America's mineral wealth. So this is part Sibley's New Mexico campaign in '62, trying to gain control of the Western territories and forge a path to California to gain physical control of the Western mines and so on. But it's also a part naval campaign where the Confederate Navy is trying to intercept the ships carrying gold from California to New York, and then efforts by the US Navy to convoy those vessels, protect those vessels, and seek out the Confederate naval forces. So it's part things that you've heard of for sure, like it's part Sibley's campaign and other Confederate efforts to gain control of those areas. It's part things that you've heard of in other avenues, like the West India Squadron in the Caribbean with Charles Wilkes and so on. It's part CSS Shenandoah in the Pacific, but there are a lot of other hidden factors, and it's kind of piecing it together into a cohesive naval campaign that frankly nobody's ever heard of before, but existed for a long time.
That sounds like it's going to be a fascinating read.
I hope so. I just have to finish writing it first.
Well, great. Well, thank you very much, Neil. We've enjoyed it greatly, and good luck going forward. And hopefully we'll hear from you again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, thanks. And just a reminder, everybody, October 19th is our next Zoom session with Jennifer Murray on George Meade. Thanks. Good night, everyone.